Welcome to Rappler Talk. I'm Marites Vitug, and joining us is Daniel Wagner, based in New York. He's CEO of Country Risk Solutions, and he's an author. And we're going to talk about his most recent book, China Vision. Welcome to Rappler, Daniel, and thank you
with you, Marites.
Thank you for waking up early. It's about 7 a.m. your time. And
my pleasure.
So first, let me ask you, your new book is entitled China Vision. What made you decide to write this book? I know China is a very hot topic, but why this particular book about China?
Well, I've been going to China since 1986. I've been doing business there for many years. And this is a book that I wanted to write for a long time, actually. I think it's really pertinent now, given what's going on vis-a-vis China and the rest of the world. If you look at the title of the book, you'll see that there's can you see it?
Yes, yes, very clear.
Yeah, there's a photo, it's not a photo, it's a caricature of President Xi. He's looking through binoculars, and when he looks through the binoculars, what he sees is China, Chinese flag.
The reflection,
and so what I think what this is really evidence of is China trying to create a world in its own image. I think it's really important to focus on that now, because China hasn't finished rising as a power. It's sort of in the middle of what it's doing. And I wanted to raise awareness about what China is doing, how it's doing it, and the impact that it's having on international relations.
And how is China creating the world in its own image? In your book, you cite, I think you go through various examples globally. So maybe just pick a few or one, which we can relate to here in Southeast Asia.
Let me put it into context first. And the context is that China used to be the world's largest and most important economic, political, and military power about 150 years ago. And from the Chinese perspective, what they're doing is achieving what they had already back in that time. So for them, they're picking up where they left off. For the US and for other powers in the world, they're being alarmed because they're seeing their power eroded. How is China doing this? China is doing this largely by expanding both its hard and soft power. Its hard power by, for instance, already having built the world's largest navy. Many people do not realize that. It's even larger than the US already. And also through soft power by distributing money and giving loans throughout the developing world. And what we see is that whether it's in Asia or Africa or Latin America, what's happening is that China is practicing something called debt trap diplomacy, which means that these highly indebted poor countries and emerging countries are signing these agreements with Chinese companies and the Chinese government to build nice infrastructure for them and do things that are a net positive for the economy, or should be. But what ends up happening is that they get so highly indebted that this debt can never be repaid. And the agreements that the Chinese government and these Chinese companies put into effect basically mean that if the payment is not made, they take over the asset. So they make these loans knowing that they're never going to be repaid. What are some examples? Some examples would be, for example, in Kenya with the railway, which is ultimately designed to help promote the trade flow of course, but also there's a net benefit to China. And so Kenya has now $50 billion of debt, which it's never going to be repaid. In Zambia has more debt now than it had when it 20 years ago, when it was in the process of relieving its debt and paying off its debt. And in Sri Lanka, for example, there was $8 billion of debt. And as a result, the Chinese have taken over the Hambantota port because the government could not pay it. So those are just a few examples of what's going on here. China is a force for potential good, and I want to stress that. This is not all a negative story. And what I talk about in the book is part negative and part positive in virtually every topic I discuss. China has the power to be a force of net good. The question is, will it choose to do so?
And this is also a warning, or it gives lessons for countries, let's say like the Philippines. We are now currently being given loans by China. But in your experience, are these loan terms transparent? Are they, can governments make them open to the public so that we know what's happening between China and, let's say, like the Philippines?
Well, of course, that's up to each individual government to decide what to do. But a lot of the negotiations are extremely private, and they'll never see the light of public day. And so it's really a question of whether there are laws in force in each individual country to make those things transparent. And ultimately, this is a question of law and order. This is a question of transparency at a national level. If individual leaders, if governments want to make this stuff transparent and want to involve the people in the decision-making process, of course they can, but that's just generally not how it's done.
But countries can say no to these loans and infrastructure projects like Malaysia under Mahathir, and also Myanmar. I think you wrote about that. So what made these countries, stand up to China in that sense?
Well, they certainly have the option of saying no, but here's the difficult part. The amount of money that's sloshing around the global system and that is available for development projects for any given country is limited. I'll use the example of Ecuador. Back in the 90s, in the early part of this century, Ecuador was a far leftist regime. It was an outcast with many countries that traditionally lend to it. And so it had a decision to make. If it wanted to get loans, where was it going to get it from? It got it from the Chinese. Similarly with Venezuela. Venezuela, surprisingly, as rich a country as it should be with all of its hydrocarbon reserves and its oil industry, should be an extremely wealthy country. But for obvious reasons, it is not. Where did it turn for money? It turned to China. China has lent Venezuela something like $60 billion. Wow. So when we see what's going on in Venezuela and this power play, what it's really all about is not necessarily just the oil. And it's not necessarily just, the U.S. trying to flex its muscles. It is a power play between China, the U.S., and in this case also Russia, which has lent $25 billion to the Maduro regime. So if we talk about it in that context, then it's understandable why some of these countries that need money would turn to China. China is very happy to lend to them, and it sees an opportunity. It's an opportunity to flex its own muscles and to exercise its soft power and gain greater influence in the world. You can't really blame China for wanting to do that. I think most any country that has the ability to do so would probably do something very similar.
But in the case of Myanmar, I think Myanmar is is an ally of China. Among the Southeast Asian countries, it's close to China. Yet it was able to say no at least to one infrastructure project, but China continues to provide them loans.
Yeah, and this has sort of been a lesson for China. China was not accustomed, especially in Asia, to having countries put up resistance when it wanted to make investments, or when it, as you rightly point out, when it has an ally government like it does in Myanmar. What happened in that case was that environmental activists got collectivized, and they put forth a national effort to oppose this dam, the Myitsone Dam. And it was successful. It was really surprising at the time that in a country like that, where the military holds such sway at the time, and where it still does, of course, but where the people are unaccustomed to having such victories over the government or over a foreign power, that this happened. And I think it gave China cause for pause, and it basically made them think about what their general approach is going to be. I think what this is translated into is that there are going to be more examples around the world where China is going to find that it's going to have a backlash. There is a backlash that's going on now. This backlash is a global phenomenon. It's certainly happening in Africa, Latin America, and of course in Asia. I don't think that that's going to stop anytime soon. What I think is going to happen is that China is going to modify how it does what it does, and it's already in the process of doing so.
Like what? Like how will they modify or amend the way they're doing business with developing countries?
I'll use Africa as an example here again. In Africa, China understands that it's the future. It's the continent which has the most growth. It is where there is the most youth, the most potential future buyers. And it has modified what it's doing in some of these countries because it wants to have Africa as a partner. And so it's taking slightly less onerous terms. It's reaching out more to the government. It's employing more nationals. And it's in its own interest to do so. It realizes that. And so it pivots and it modifies when it needs to.
So you mean Chinese companies in Africa don't necessarily bring in their own employees? Because that's a big issue now in the Philippines. There are like thousands or hundreds of thousands of Chinese workers here employed for like a bridge project or infrastructure project, and there's a lot of complaint. Even our finance minister said that they are not paying taxes, and they ought to pay taxes, and there's resentment also from locals. So you mean that can be changed? They can change the way they do business?
Well, this is a perfect example of whether there are sufficient laws and regulations in place to prevent that kind of abuse from happening. But in fairness, no one forces any government or any nation to accept Chinese investment. No one forces them to accept the terms that the Chinese would like to have. Yes, in times of need, they're under pressure and they might do things that they wouldn't otherwise be inclined to do. But I'll use the example of Africa again, because I speak a lot about it in the book. There's a widely held belief that most of the projects that go on in Africa that are supported by China have exclusively or primarily Chinese workers. There are some Chinese workers, there's no question about that. But they are not mostly Chinese workers in a lot of examples. In fact, there was a Africa-wide survey that was done on this very topic, and most Africans actually welcomed the Chinese and Chinese investment, and most of them turned out to be pretty happy with what was going on. They may not realize how indebted they're becoming in the process or the influence China has over the country in the process. Now, I understand how important this is in a country like the Philippines. I used to live there, as you know. What's going on there is no different really than what's going on everywhere else. The question is, where's the balance? Where is the balance between, having some Chinese workers and having primarily or mostly Filipino workers, as it should be? If that was the case, and where it is the case, then the net benefits to the Philippines should be very clear.
And actually, a big thing here also is online gaming. It's not allowed in China, so they're here, and I think that's where most of the workers, Chinese workers employees rather, are here. They're living in Makati, in like Alabang, or these big cities. And I don't know if this will change eventually, if they can also amend the way they do business. But again, as you said, it's up to the Philippine government to decide. But anyway, Daniel, you said in your book that China should be held accountable because they impose their way of thinking or their vision on other countries, and they breach international law. So how do countries hold China accountable?
Again, it goes back to the rule of law, Marites. It's a question of, is there a framework in each country that would permit some boundaries to be established in terms of where the stopping point is in negotiations? What ends up happening inevitably is that the existing leader puts in place some agreement, and then another leader takes over, and they either cancel it, as Mahathir did in Malaysia, or they choose to implement it, or they renegotiate it on somewhat more favorable terms. I think the Malaysian example is really a good one, in fact, because here was a case where Razak had, put in tens of billions of dollars of Chinese investment. A lot of this ended up lining his own pocket and helping to promote his own re-election campaign. One of the first things that Mahathir did is he actually went to Beijing, to the Great Hall of the People, and he said, "I'm canceling your contracts," which I thought was unbelievable. And I think, that also should have been a wake-up call for China to basically say, you can't necessarily count on anything. I've been in the business of promoting cross-border trade and investment and lending for decades. And one of the things that I've learned is that if you have a fair contract, which is fair for everyone involved, you're unlikely to have a problem. So one thing that I don't understand is, why is it that the Chinese don't understand this? that it's in their own long-term interests to implement contracts which are fair to everyone.
So is that the eternal puzzle? Why doesn't China adhere to fair standards or the rule of law? Again, in the Philippines, for example, the Philippine government took China to account. It went to the International Tribunal, sought a decision on its maritime dispute with China over South China Sea. The Philippines won, but as you said, there was a change of leaders, and now Duterte has shelved the ruling in favor of the Philippines. So,
well, of course, you're the expert on this subject with your book Rock Solid. But
thank you for promoting my book.
But for what it's worth, my own frame of reference is that this is an exercise in realpolitik. Welcome to the world of realpolitik, right? Where it's unimaginable in my mind that the Philippines would win this Hague ruling, and just a few years later, they would be, I don't want to say kowtowing because that's not accurate. They would be more than willing to do business with China on Chinese terms. Now, I understand that Philippines needs money. I understand it needs infrastructure investment, all of those things. And there's only a limited amount of money to go around, as I said earlier. But what I think has happened is that with the U.S. withdrawing from the world, and with some of the things that have happened in Asia, and some of the dynamics of going on bilaterally between the Philippines and China, which both, by the way, want a good and favorable relationship, that there's some give and take. Now, the Philippines certainly gets something from the investments that are being made. China certainly gets something. The question is, has this been done on a fair basis? Will the agreements that have been put in place endure past the Duterte administration? Now, it might. We don't know what the terms of those agreements are. We don't know how unfair to the Philippines it might be. Only a future president or the Congress can make that determination. But what I would say is, there's an opportunity here as well for something good to come out of this. I don't think any Asian power can afford to simply ignore China, and they do so at their own peril. And by the way, where the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, is concerned, there's really only one Asian power that has said they don't want anything to do with it, and that's India. Virtually every other nation has said, I'm in. Let's see how we can do this. That's worth considering as well.
In your book, you said that there is no alternative. You don't see an alternative to China's omnipresence here in Asia, at least. But how about U.S., Japan, Australia, India, coming together or individually? I mean, can they pose a counterpoint to China?
Well, yes and no is the short answer. Yes, in the sense that, they still matter. They're powerful forces. They have alliances in place. The U.S. does a lot with Japan and Australia and India individually. They have, mutual defense agreements in place, et cetera. And by the way, the Philippines has many, many mutual defense agreements in place. The question is, would it ever use it? But I look at groupings like ASEAN, and I look at the Shangri-La dialogue that goes on every year in Singapore among defense ministers. And, all of this has happened with those groupings being in place and with the existing order being in place. So now we have the position order coming into play. And really the question is, can anyone prevent it from happening? Certainly, unless there was a more meaningful grouping between these countries, and unless there was some action that's going to be taken that's different from what we have right now vis-a-vis the U.S., I think China pretty much understands that it can more or less do whatever it wants in Asia.
A new development, or maybe not new, this has been going on for some time, is that the Chinese economy is not really doing that great. In fact, it's slowing down. Is that a factor that will affect its vision for the world, the China vision?
It's certainly going to have an impact in terms of how much it has, how willing it is and how much money it has to invest abroad. But I don't think it's at a stage where they're having to make very critical decisions. Bear in mind that it's now part of China's foreign policy to make foreign direct investment in terms of tens of billions a year. And it's in its own interest to do so, of course, so I think it's going to continue to do so as long as it can. The Chinese economy is set to grow 6 to 6.5% this year, if we can believe official statistics. And that is not crisis mode for them. They've been slowing down for many years. My expectation also is that there will, in a fairly short time, be an agreement between the US and China on trade, which should ratchet down tension, which should then help their economy stabilize. But I think from the US perspective, we certainly realize that the impact that the trade disagreements have had on the Chinese economy has enabled the US to be successful in its negotiations and has forced China to take a hard look at its ways.
Here in the Philippines, should we be concerned about Huawei? They have investments here. There are other big Chinese companies as well. China Offshore National Oil Corporation is coming in. China Telecoms is coming in. So what are the risks the Philippines faces with these huge Chinese companies operating in the Philippines?
Well, this is a topic that I put some thought into, as you can appreciate. As you know, the US, Australia, New Zealand have all banned Huawei products going forward. But interestingly, the UK has decided to go forward with Huawei, and Germany wants to be in a position to continue to go forward, for example. So unless and until there is public evidence of what the risks are, of the security risks of using Huawei products, I think more and more countries are going to decide to use it. Now, there will come a point in time where the US may share some of its intelligence, if it hasn't already, with countries like the Philippines to help them decide what it is that they want to do. But I would also say at the same time that there's no way, I don't think, that the US, Australia, and New Zealand would say that they absolutely don't want Huawei products if there was no perceived risk. And we've seen in the past that there is software embedded in a lot of electronic products, not only from China, but from Russia, maybe even from South Korea and the US, for all we know. That being the case, for critical infrastructure, for national security purposes, these countries don't want to take a chance. And frankly, I don't blame them.
So we still don't have this critical evidence about what Huawei really does here in the Philippines as far as the Philippine government is concerned. It's still welcome here in the Philippines. Anyway, maybe last question about soft power. Have you experienced or have you come across China funding elections or interfering in other countries' elections like what Russia supposedly did in the US? I mean, does China do this?
Yes, China does do this, but frankly, I don't necessarily have a big problem with the idea of trying to influence other people's elections, because that's what countries do. The US has been doing that for decades. Russia's doing it now in a very visible fashion. I shouldn't say I have no problem with it. I should just say I expect it to happen. So from my perspective, I'll use the Russia-US example, and then we'll go to China. What is the bigger issue? Is it the issue that Russia interfered in the 2016 election, the 2018 election, and probably the 2020 election? Or is the issue that it was so relatively easy to do? Who is to blame? Is the US to blame for not having better federal election laws and the ability to protect its elections from cyber attacks? I mean, that's a big part of the issue here. And I think that's a wake-up call for governments around the world to ramp up their cybersecurity. Every country in the world has this potential issue. Where China is concerned, I'm not aware of specific instances where it has directly influenced elections, but you can be sure with the amount of influence that it has around the world that it has done whatever it has done in a way that is trying to meet its own needs. And again, that's what countries do.
Yeah, I'm asking because we're coming up with our midterm elections in May, and one of the leading political parties here, which belongs to the administration, invited Chinese Communist Party officials during their anniversary last year. It was quite unusual, actually a first in the Philippines, for a Philippine political party to celebrate its anniversary with the launch of President Xi Jinping's book last year. Anyway, it was just different. So I was thinking maybe we should be more vigilant about the upcoming elections. But as you say, that's expected of powers. Anyway, the US has been doing it.
Well, what the example you give is a really good example. I mean, why would that be happening? Was that the Philippine party's idea, or was it, through some Chinese influence that happened? Again, no one forces anyone to do this. No one forces anyone to buy a given book. It's free will. But I would also say that, the landscape is changing, Martes. It's changing in a way that none of us can quite comprehend. We're introducing artificial intelligence into the electoral process. Fake news is taking on a whole new meaning. Soon we won't be able to distinguish between a presidential candidate that is real and one that is manufactured by artificial intelligence. They have the ability already to do this in video and make statements that a candidate did not actually already make. So where is fact and where is fiction? I think that's a really interesting line that we're going to have to cross and address sometime very soon.
On that scary note, Daniel, we thank you for this interview, and maybe that could be part of your next book, Where is Fact and Where is Fiction? Thank you so much for joining us.
Great.
And
thank you very much.
Yeah, to our listeners and viewers, we hope you continue to follow us, and we'll talk more about China issues in our series of interviews. Thank you.